Hello everyone, Chad with Data Prep U here, coming to you from my home office right here in Golden, Colorado. Now, for today's episode, we're going to focus on an Alteryx macro. Now, a few of you may be aware already, but previously we held a free series where we trained on Alteryx macros. Now, it was only a two-part series, but it began with a session that just demystified what an actual macro was and the tools that are involved in creating one and why you would want to use one in the first place. And in the second session, we actually built a macro live. We helped you walk through the steps for creating a macro. Now, what's unique about that second session is that we actually gave all of our students the option of which macro they wanted to build out. And we gave them a choice between three different options. The one that the students actually chose was the ability to take two separate data streams and compare the structures of those data streams. So it would actually just do a quick comparison on the field names and output a simple report that identified or highlighted the discrepancies in those field names between two separate data sources. Now, once we got through that session, we had multiple requests to actually have another training on the remaining two macros. And we thought, well, we think our YouTube channel is going to be a perfect fit for that. So here we are. Now, in today's session, what we're going to focus on is a macro called determine first row. And the use case around this is that one of our customers actually had a consistent file delivery from multiple different customers. Now, the challenge with this is that every single time there were a number of blank or null rows prior to the actual header row starting. Now, in their particular case, it was relatively easy to go through and just say, okay, skip X number of rows or skip N number of rows. However, that became just more and more tedious, and they thought, well, isn't there a way to do this a little bit better? So I actually took it upon myself to kind of revamp the overall or the underlying workflow with this and completely changed what they had originally done and did it kind of my own way. You know, one of the beautiful things about Alteryx is that it allows you to kind of create your own path and create your own method for these workflows. So why don't we jump right into it? Okay, so what we're looking at right now is the inner workings of this macro called determine first row. Now, in my case, I always try to make these tools and these macros that I create as automatic as possible, and that can be dependent on a number of different things. Now, in this particular case, I'm going to go ahead and start with with just running the macro. I want to start with my test data so we can work through this. Now, what we're going to focus on right now at the very beginning is our macro input tool. Now, this is located in the interface tool category here. And every time you drop one of these macro inputs or macro output to the canvas, that creates another anchor for your specific macro. Now, in this particular case, our sample data has 3 null values. So what I end up doing is I actually create a quick little record ID. And I kind of created a unique value off of that, or a unique name off of that, something that I don't feel would ever be duplicated. And then from there we go into a sample tool that just says, hey, you know what, let's just keep the first 200-ish rows. Now this can be changed to your liking. Now I kind of felt that I've never really seen just a random 200 null rows or anything even leading up to that or anything more than just a few. So I figured 200 would be a safe bet just to take a sample of this. And from there what I did was I took a little transpose ultimately trying to figure out how many of these were completely null. How many records were completely null across the board? And I determined that using a summarize tool, doing a quick little group by on my actual record ID, as you can see down here, and then doing a count of the number of records there were and then how many null values there were, which as you can see gives me a really nice bit of info in here that allows me to do a simple filter saying if the count of total rows for that record ID equals the count of completely null values, let's get rid of it. So that's exactly what I did in this particular filter tool. I just said, hey, whenever my count does not equal the count of the null values here, that is a valid row. From there, ideally, or in most cases, at least in the cases that we've seen, this particular row now becomes our very first row. So we now have that record ID telling us exactly which row contains those header values. So I used a little sample tool here just to say, all right, let's just take the very first row out of this, being that record ID number 4 in our case, and then I used an append fields tool to append that to our overall total number of rows. Now, you might think, well, why are you actually doing this? Well, it gives me that very first start record and then the total number of original rows that we actually had. So what we then were able to do is use a generate rows tool to actually kind of fill in the gaps, fill in the blanks. So I could say, if you haven't used the generate rows tool before, essentially what this allows you to do is have a start point and an end point, and then actually literally create physical rows based on a criteria that you set. So in this case, we had our start record of 4 and a total rows of 46. So I just said, hey, every time you create a new row, just increment this ID by 1 until your ID becomes, under the records to keep, your ID becomes whatever that max total rows is. So now guess what? We have the actual record ID of all of the rows to keep. Now what's really great about this is this will even skip completely null rows altogether throughout the rest of your data, throughout the rest of your workflow. So this becomes something very easy to join on because we now have a numeric value that allows us to join based on the records to keep to our originally newly created record ID. And then finally giving us that actual header row at the very top, to which we can then use our dynamic rename tool to automatically rename those rows to our header rows, and then finally use an output or a macro output to output those records. Now in real life, if we were to create a brand new workflow here and then go to insert macro, just to take a quick look at what the macro looks like on the surface here, let's zoom in a couple of clicks, I can see that I have a simple input and an output, and there is no additional configuration. Again, really focusing on being able to actually input data without having to do much, if any, sort of real configuration here. Once again, my name is Chad with Data Prep U. We've just focused on the first of 2 macros that we're going to be highlighting in our YouTube series that came from actual customer use cases. So if you liked what you saw, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more great information. For additional information as well, you please go to dataprepu.com and you can see a list of all of the different courses that we offer that go into an incredible amount of detail and are focused on Alteryx Core certification, Alteryx Advanced certification, even machine learning, and so on and so on. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.